Thank you, Mr. President. I'll just find my way back to where I needed to start here. And thank you to the Honourable Member for Murchison for that contribution, which was quite comprehensive around the issue, unlike the second reading speech, unlike the absence of any evidence base presented along with this bill for the claims made in that scant second reading speech about its apparent intent. Doesn't even warrant pretending to present an argument, apparently, to give this gift to people who in many instances will be utterly unrequiring of it. And to pretend that doing that and put a veneer over it that somehow it's helping people with cost of living or housing affordability is quite offensive in my view, quite offensive. I recognise that the bill intends to implement commitments made during Premier Gutwin's State of the State address in March. And I note this is the second amendment to the state's land tax rate that we've had following last year, 2021's Treasury Miscellaneous Cost of Living and Affordable Housing Support Bill. I think that what we have here is a bill which is an example of incredibly problematic public policy making. It's based on flawed and entirely discredited ideas like trickle-down economic theory. Somehow providing an economic benefit to people who are haves will somehow trickle down to people who are have-nots. We know that that's a nonsense. It's been shown to be categorically. There's no guarantee at all that the stated goals of this bill can or will be delivered by it. The only guarantee of financial relief in this bill is for a particular stakeholder group, a housing stakeholder group or a property stakeholder group, who are land tax payers. And certainly that in a Venn diagram does not overlap very much with the people who are most vulnerable in terms of housing affordability and cost of living in this state. This bill is not driven by evidence-based data and does not include any measures directly linking land tax relief to rent relief or housing affordability relief. And I'll speak about that more later because other jurisdictions have tackled things like this around the issue of land tax, but they have made those links more explicit and more direct so that the intended outcomes could more robustly be expected to be delivered. We haven't bothered to do that here. We've just gone with some rhetorical veneer that this is somehow about assisting people who need it. It's not. As land tax is only paid by those who own more than one property, there's a risk of a potential perceived conflict of interest, I think, in debating and passing a land tax relief package without disclosing potentially the benefit that might come to us or me as an individual here voting on the bill. I think it's particularly important in this instance, given what I just said about the failure of this bill to mandate that savings, benefit received, is somehow passed along to those in need. I think it's particularly important to acknowledge that one may be a beneficiary, and certainly I feel that way about myself. I think we have a right as a community and we have an expectation as members in this place to deliver people very proactive and routine and accountable declarations of that sort of nature. We have an expectation that that happens not just where there are both actually perceived or potential conflicts of interest as well as material conflicts of interest. A material conflict of interest might mean we recuse ourselves. In this instance, I think a perceived or a potential conflict of interest or beneficiary, being a beneficiary of this bill warrants a declaration. We know that, of course, people could go to members' declarations of interest, that's in the public domain, to ascertain who may be someone who might benefit from this bill. And of course, that's available. But that's something that's a high bar to expect people to go through. I'd very much personally like to see something much more proactive and routine than that. We also, of course, know that members' interests declarations are out of date. They're not current, as in they look retrospectively back at the year that preceded them being tabled here publicly. And that means that whenever a given bill might be before us here, even if people were to look back to declarations of interest, they might not find something that related to the bill, but that had actually come about and been part of it. So that's why I am making it clear here, because I'm a prime example of that. In the intervening time since our last declarations were made, I now have a property that is tenanted, and therefore I may be perceived to be or potentially be a beneficiary of this bill. And people wouldn't necessarily find that in the public domain in my declaration of interest. They'll see it in next year's. So I'd like to put that on the record here. I don't think it means that I need to recuse myself from participating in the debate or the vote, but I think it's appropriate in the context of my contribution and appropriate for the public to understand. So the second reading speech of this bill, Mr President, scant though it was, says that this bill is the government taking further action to do two things. Firstly, to ease the cost of living for Tasmanian families, and secondly, to continue adding downward pressure on rents. That's what it says in the second reading speech. And we'll unpack both of those here, and the member for Murchison has already done some of that unpacking for us also. Other members may comment on it as well. But first, before I do that, I'd like to remember that this is the second time that we've had these sorts of measures brought to us and passed through to provide similar sorts of relief. And I would have thought that that must surely mean we could have confidence that the first iteration has been fully assessed and evaluated for its impact and the level of success it had in achieving its stated outcomes in terms of cost of living, in terms of housing affordability and whatever other outcomes were presented around that. Surely that would be an important piece of evaluative work of a policy and of a piece of legislation that would then feed through into the development of a Mark II, if you will, a 2.0 attempt. Surely we could have confidence, Mr President, that that evaluation, that assessment and analysis would have occurred in the first iteration, the first time we gave people similar benefit around land tax. And yet clearly it does not appear, we certainly haven't been provided here with any work of that nature. Anything to indicate that previously we could point to a policy that provided similar land tax relief that then flowed through and provided outcomes in cost of living relief to those who need it or housing affordability relief to those who need it. I don't believe that evidence has been presented. I would like to see it from the government if it exists. I would have presumed good policy making would have meant it was the basis for the decision to undertake this particular policy and give it effect through this bill. Sadly, I suspect not. In particular, we would, I think, expect to have seen evaluation of the extent that those particular aims were achieved. Because what we're talking about here is the potential, or at least, yes, the potential to provide relief to those who need it most, and whether we're doing that effectively. There's particular ways we could do that in terms of land tax and relief that flowed through. I don't believe we've done it this time. I don't believe we did it last time. And to paraphrase Oscar Wilde, Mr President, to pass one suite of land tax relief measures without policy impact data to show it worked is regrettable, but to do it twice cannot just be regarded as carelessness. It's actually irresponsible and unconscionable of the government to be doing this. But let's unpack those stated aims, shall we? We're told, Mr President, that increasing the tax-free threshold to $100,000, increasing the maximum land value threshold to $500,000 and reducing the rate of tax on land under $500,000 to 0.45% will provide cost relief to all land taxpayers. Indeed, it will. We are given to understand 70,000 landowners benefiting from this, and it's estimated by the government that around 1,800 landowners will no longer pay land tax from the 1st of July 2022. That the average benefit in the first year would be in the vicinity of $581, with a maximum saving of $1,625. Overall, I understand the government estimates this will provide around $39 million of tax relief for property owners, or put another way, perhaps be a loss of $39 million in state revenue. So that's what we've been told. We'll talk about that loss of revenue later too, no doubt. But I don't see here, and I've asked in the briefing, the leader has endeavoured or undertaken to provide this to me later. It's not going to be particularly helpful later, but I would like to have it anyway. But the questions that I was seeking answers to were along these lines. We don't see any distinction in those figures between, say, commercial and residential properties. Who are the 70,000 landowners that are benefiting? This is an important question because this is a key decision by the government to provide this gift, essentially, to these 70,000 Tasmanians. Where's the modelling that shows us the basic demographics of the beneficiaries of this legislation? Where do they live? What regions of our state? What's their income profile? What's their gender profile, their age profile? What's their disability profile? How many of them, Mr. President, are currently securely housed? This bill does nothing to provide any guarantee that financial benefits or relief from financial pressures that it provides will be targeted to those most in need. Where's the evidence that land tax is a pressing cost of living burden to those in our community who are the most vulnerable to cost of living pressures? I don't think if we went to our most vulnerable that their land tax bill is the biggest burden they face. And most of them would probably ask us, the what? Where's the analysis or modelling that shows that the group of beneficiaries from this policy and this bill are the ones that should be prioritised for government assistance and in this specific way? Where is the modelling and analysis that tells us that this is the best way to spend $39 million worth of tax revenue for our state? That these people deserve that largesse more than other measures we could provide to others in our community. I will be a beneficiary, most likely, of this measure, I imagine, and I can categorically confirm, Mr. President, that I do not require it. In fact, I find it quite nauseating to be here facilitating through this debate what will be in many instances unneeded financial assistance for landowners, pretending that it is to assist with cost of living or housing affordability, while far too many Tasmanians will be sleeping in cold cars tonight or tents by our highways. It's extraordinary and inexcusable, I think, that we don't have any argument presented from the government to justify this gift and to contrast it or compare it to other options they had before them to provide support on cost of living or housing affordability. Mr. President, the second reason given here related to apparently this bill and this measure adding downward pressure on rents. I follow on from the comments and fully endorse the comments made by the member for Murchison on the absolute nonsense of this claim. Absolute nonsense. In fact, it's interesting, there was even some backpedalling, I think, from it in some comments made to move away from the idea of downward pressure on rents and try to reframe it somewhat and instead run out a line that it was, in fact, potentially not to put upward pressure on rents. Now, this is problematic. As soon as you start to back away and backpedal from a claim, which is still in the second reading speech here, mind you, so I presume it's still a claim the government would like to stand by, that this will somehow put downward pressure on rents. I'd like to hear that argument prosecuted. Beg your pardon?
Through you, Mr. President, hopefully you may be one of the ones that pass it on to your renters.
Hopefully I will be. Indeed, that will be an individual decision for me.
Yes.
There's nothing here, though, that requires me to do that. Other states have actually put more measures in place to make that a more direct flow of benefit. This government, your government, didn't do that, made no requirement of it. And as the member for Murchison pointed out, there's no market imperative for it to be passed on whatsoever, none. And I also note, I believe, comments in the public domain from the government to say that, well, given that people kick up a fuss about increases in land tax putting upward pressure on rents, therefore this must do the opposite. Well, that's nonsense. Of course, if as a landlord my costs increase, given basic financial literacy, I will look to meet those costs through what I have available and therefore potentially put rents up. That's a natural and understandable sequence of events. If I'm provided with a saving, there is nothing that requires or prompts me to then pass that straight through to someone else. It's a gift, outright to the person who's receiving it. Just going to find my place here. I would like to hear from the government exactly how they propose to demonstrate what impact this policy has had on rents down the track when we say a year into it. How will they be assessing its success in either downward pressure on rents or any, in fact, impact on rents? I would like to know exactly how that's going to be brought to us and demonstrated through analysis. I'd also like to know, in terms, looking back to those 70,000 beneficiaries of this bill, not just some of those other breakdowns that I mentioned earlier, but I'd also like to know which of these 70,000 are landlords and in fact do have rental properties that are currently rented out. So if we're talking about this proposition of downward pressure on rents, how many rental properties are we talking about? How many of those are commercial? How many are residential? So I'm interested to know that, because that would tell us, in broad terms, how many current houses out there amongst our housing stock might be benefited from this. It will also feed into however the government proposes to evaluate its success. It will tell us broadly how many current tenants, who are amongst generally the most vulnerable people in our community, tenants in the private rental market, will tell us how many of them may expect potentially some benefit from this. What's the cost benefit for the state in foregoing this taxation revenue, I wonder, Mr President? Especially considering that we could be devoted to other areas of urgent need when we look at both cost of living and housing affordability. We can certainly look to our housing assistance services, our crisis accommodation assistance services and other programs of that sort, and readily identify areas where $39 million could be used to great good effect. So what I ask the government is to pay for this $39 million gift to property owners. What services to which groups of vulnerable Tasmanians are you cutting to provide this financial bonus to the property class in our state? And how are you going to measure that that is a worthwhile and cost-benefit positive measure for our state overall compared to the things that will be cut to pay for it? I'd like to take a moment, Mr President, to remind ourselves about why potential cuts to the services, or at least the neglect to provide extra benefit and funding to the services that relate to our housing and homelessness programs, is so outrageous right now. To neglect to support them, to neglect to prioritise those measures above this measure is absolutely unconscionable. We've got a current crisis in affordable housing, but in fact, actually that doesn't do it justice. We have an urgent emergency in terms of housing in this state. I look at things like the Rental Affordability Index that's done. That's a partnership between National Shelter, the Brotherhood of St Lawrence, Beyond Bank Australia and SGS Economics and Planning. That's a regular and reliable measure of affordability across the nation. And what does that most recent one from November 2021, just a few months ago, tell us? Well, it tells us, certainly, when I look on page 46, where it's talking about national trends and metropolitan areas, that rental affordability index tells us, and I quote, Greater Hobart continues to be the least affordable capital city in Australia for the average rental households of each city. The improvement in affordability during the second quarter of 2020 was short-lived, and rents have continued to rise rapidly, pushing affordability to a historic low point. Over the past 5 years, the RAI score of Greater Hobart has decreased by over 5% per annum, leaving it as the only capital city in Australia where rental affordability for the average rental household is below the critical threshold of 100. With an RAI score of 87 in June 2021, the average rental household would pay 34% of its income if renting at the median rate. Although household incomes in Tasmania are significantly lower than the national average, rents are only marginally lower than mainland averages. The gap between income and rent has been widening over the past 4 years with little sign of abating. A comparison of RAI scores in Greater Hobart and Greater Sydney over recent years shows that while the two cities have shared similar levels of rental affordability in the past, the gap between their RAI scores has widened considerably since 2017. There is a stark contrast in affordability trends across mainland capital cities. Both Greater Sydney and Greater Melbourne have improved in affordability during the COVID-19 pandemic and over the longer term. But, Mr President, the point that this report makes is that Hobart has gotten worse. And I note further comments recently, just in the media, from the Tenants' Union of Tasmania, reported in the Mercury on the May 2022, where the Tenants' Union claimed that over the past 5 years, rents have increased significantly, with Hobart seeing a 45% increase in that time, the past 5 years. Launceston, wait for it, a 49% increase, and the North West a 27% increase. The Tenants' Union says that the data tells us Hobart's now the more expensive to rent in than Perth, Adelaide, Brisbane and Melbourne. We can see that the picture is even more stark, actually, when we really dig down and look at detail that is presented in Anglicare's rental affordability snapshot in 2022. It came out just last month. It's done every April, this snapshot. It's done over the course of one weekend at the beginning of April. It gathers information on all properties advertised for rent in the state on that weekend. It includes all property types, including share house options, and it assesses the availability and affordability of the options available for rent across 14 low-income household types. Mr President, it generally is very grim reading. And during the years that I was responsible for its production as the manager of the Social Action and Research Centre at Anglicare, it was across a time where we were seeing increasing intensity for our housing emergency and was just beginning to ramp up, 2015, 16, 17, 18, across those times. But now I note, here we are in 2022, and the affordability snapshot came out last month, and it's even worse. And I'm just going to point to one part from that report, which talks about the south of the state, and it's on page 7 of that report. And it says this about the south under the heading Availability. The decline in the number of rental properties advertised in the south has continued in 2022. There were 323 properties available this year, 25% less than last year, 75% less than in 2013. And since 2013, rental housing supply in the south has contracted by an average of 14% year on year. And then under the heading of affordability, it says this: the rental market in the south is hardest for families with children. A single person who is able to live in a share house can find some options, but a family requiring a 3-bedroom property needs 2 full-time wages coming in before they can afford a home in the Hobart area. A working single parent or single income family will find only a handful of properties in rural areas that they can afford. Families on Centrelink payments have no options in the south except to pay more than 30% of their income on rent. This puts them into rental stress and is likely to cause financial hardship. Even at 49% of income, a single parent on parenting payment will only find 6 affordable two-bedroom properties. And as usual, there is nothing affordable for a young person on youth allowance or a single person on job seeker. Nothing, Mr. President, I'm saying, adding in there, nothing available that's affordable. And I go back to the report where it says a couple receiving the age pension would find 3 affordable studio bed sits, 2 of which were in a rural area, but nothing larger. A person receiving the age or disability pension, a single person, would find 5 affordable share houses. Share houses are often unsuitable for people in these groups, of course, but standalone units are out of their price range. That's just to put here on record, Mr. President. This is the situation we find ourselves in terms of housing affordability. And this is why I find it utterly offensive for the government to trot out claims about addressing housing affordability on measures like this bill. A little veneer in front of this bill, which is a gift to property owners who are most likely all securely housed, and pretend that it's about housing affordability and assisting those who are struggling in the current context. Our current context is extreme. It's utter market failure, and this bill does nothing to address it. Finally on this, because governments can do things to address it, this government is doing other things towards that. I'll speak about that in a moment. But the Grattan Institute, I was interested to read in their submission to a Commonwealth Parliamentary inquiry into housing affordability in 2021. In the Grattan Institute submission, in their summary on page 2, they note this, Mr. President. It took neglectful governments more than 2 decades to create Australia's current housing affordability mess. They preferred the easy choices that merely appear to address the problem. The politics of reform are fraught because most voters own a home and many own investment properties and mistrust any change that might dent the price of their assets. But if governments keep pretending there are easy answers, housing affordability will only get worse. Indeed, Mr. President, I agree with the Grattan Institute on that. I wanted to speak briefly about a couple of examples of other jurisdictions and things they're doing in relation to land tax, because I think it's interesting to see that it is possible to target through land tax some measures that do deliver genuine outcomes on those claimed areas that the government is talking about. If a state government was really genuinely looking, Mr. President, to pull every lever available to them in addressing this urgent emergency of housing affordability, they would look, I think, to implement further measures like these. I note just very briefly 2 quick examples. In the ACT, there is a land tax brackets affordable community housing close brackets determination from 2021. And I'll quote from the website where that's described. It says this: a parcel of land is deemed eligible for an exemption if the owner of that land enters into an agreement with a registered community housing provider and makes the parcel of land available for the purpose of affordable community housing. And for clarity, Mr. President, it also says rentals under the agreement with the registered community housing provider must be at a rate that is less than 75% of current market rent. So that's in the ACT. It's a measure that they're undertaking to encourage, through land tax relief, people to make their properties available for more affordable community housing. I note also in New South Wales, there's a build-to-rent scheme with the explicit purpose of boosting new rental supply. And in the description that's on the website there in New South Wales, from the New South Wales Government, under the heading Land Tax Build to Rent, it says this, and this is from the 24th of March this year, a couple of weeks back. It says this: the New South Wales Government introduced a land tax discount for new build-to-rent housing projects until 2040 and a new housing diversity SEPP to provide more housing options, greater surety for renters, boost construction and support jobs during the COVID recovery. What this means is the next heading, and it says this: eligible build-to-rent BTR properties will receive a 50% reduction in land value for land tax purposes. The effect of this is that land tax will be reduced. BTR developments will also receive an exemption from foreign investor duty and land tax surcharges, or a refund of surcharges paid. They're just two brief examples, and I think I don't want to get bogged down in them, but just to say we have a lot of levers available to us. Even a measure like the one that's described in this bill could be better directed and targeted to deliver the outcomes that it's vaguely claiming it's about. We could have some form of direct requirement that for those who have rental properties with residential tenants, that this was passed through, or some element of it was passed through. We could contemplate all manner of things to make this a more genuine and effective measure. The fact,
Mr. President, can I ask the honourable member, is he aware of whether the people that are going to be renting have to come from the public house wait list? Is that
from those other jurisdictions? Are you asking me about the measure from the... Well, certainly the one in the ACT. Certainly the one in the ACT would, because it's linked to community housing providers, which would facilitate housing for people on their particular register, I imagine, the way it does we have here. The New South Wales Build to Rent scheme is, I think, more about boosting supply and a benefit to try to get it more affordable housing through the supply of rental housing.
Thank you, honourable member.
But as I said, I'm not making I don't want to get bogged down in those examples to try and prosecute an argument that that's exactly what we should be doing here. We should always determine the most appropriate measures for our own jurisdiction. It was more about trying to link a direct line between the policy being provided and suggested and the actual outcome you're claiming to want to deliver, because I think that's what the government here has utterly failed to do. They've pretended that there are two particular outcomes that they're interested in from this bill, when in fact, it's my view, that they're simply interested in gifting free tax relief to people that they like. Essentially, people who are in the property class, people who they believe need a gift. That wouldn't be my view. So the government here, and no doubt in the Leader's summing up, we will hear about this, no doubt, is doing numerous things to work towards improving housing affordability, to work towards some of the issues in our housing market. We know that we hear regularly from the government and from the previous Premier, and no doubt we'll hear from this new Premier about these measures. Certainly in the upcoming budget, no doubt we'll hear more about them. They in fact have even claimed, I believe, in the other place, that they're doing more than any other government in history, in the history of Tasmania, in this space, which is quite an extraordinary claim. But here's the thing: you can't claim you're pulling every lever if you're not. And if we actually acknowledge that we're in a housing affordability emergency, and if we actually look at those people, and we all know about them because they come to our offices, but actually it's the ones who don't come to our offices because they're in the most extreme circumstances that are even more concerning. It's the people who are in those cold cars, who are in those tents in the bushland on the verges of our highways, that are of most concern here. If we did genuinely want to pull all the levers, the government would do what it's already doing, that's fine, but it would also consider things like reforming our Residential Tenancy Act and looking at some of the elements that could be brought into that Act and have it brought up to date to contemporary standards to do the outcomes for tenants and more security and more affordability. Something as straightforward as a rental cap, a rental increase cap of some sort. That can be entirely reasonable You can just make it the case that rents can only rise by CPI or CPI plus a small margin each year. Simple as that. No detriment to landlords to raise rents by that amount, especially if they're being given a gift through this bill of less land tax to pay. No detriment to capping rents. But what it would do is mean that we wouldn't have the people we are all seeing in our office, and I know we are all seeing them, who are coming to tell us about their rents that have just been put up by 30% or 40%, that have just been put up by $150 a week or the like. We hear all these stories. That kind of increase in rent is absolutely unacceptable, unconscionable. It's pure greed. And the reason we can do it is because our Residential Tenancy Act allows it. Our Residential Tenancy Act only says, as the only constraint on rent increases, that it has to be market equivalence. But because our market is going gangbusters, as soon as the guy up the road starts charging this high amount, everybody else around can argue market equivalence and bump theirs up to the same. There's no reason, nothing happened in relation to the house to justify that increase, but because it's possible to do it, that's what we're seeing. That's one measure we could be doing through reform of the Tenancy Act. There's many other things through reform of that Act that we could deliver to those most vulnerable people. We could do things that have been called for in the public domain by advocates in this space. We could look at things like vacant property taxes. We could look at things like capping the movement of whole dwellings from our private rental market into the short-term accommodation. There are all manner of things that we could be looking at if we genuinely wanted to deliver significant and material benefit and change in this space around housing affordability and actually address the urgent emergency that we face. We're tinkering around the edges so far. We're not even really delivering catch-up through what has been proposed. And I say proposed because the announcement of, I think it's $1 billion and 10,000 homes over a decade, that announcement is laudable. But until we see it delivered, we can't rely on it. And it certainly is a longer term, off in the future outcome. It's not doing anything right now. And this bill is doing nothing to accompany it and deliver a better outcome. Of course, we know the federal government could step up too. Of course, we would like to see the federal government address this sort of thing through increasing JobSeeker, increasing the rental assistance, providing its funding to build more social housing and public housing. All of those things could be done. Taxation reform at a federal level. But Mr President, let me just finish up by, I guess, summarising my view of this bill. I don't support the bill because I don't support the policy that's in it. I think it's utterly ham-fisted and problematic in both design, in that it lacks an evidence base, it lacks anything that says this is the right thing to do or points us towards it delivering the outcomes it makes claims to. And about, I think, the fact that it is really, in a sneaky way, delivering an outcome that I think is perverse in the current context, delivering benefit to those who are likely to not be amongst those most vulnerable and are likely to be not amongst those most affected by cost of living and affordable housing challenges. I would absolutely encourage the government to investigate those other public policy measures which could be implemented, whether we draw ideas from other interstate jurisdictions or whether we look at those other things that are available to us within our current context. I encourage the government to look at those. I encourage them to think about, if they do want to make changes to land tax, to think about making it more directly linked to the outcomes put forward. Put something in there that actually requires a downward movement in rents, for example, rather than a fanciful suggestion that that might occur. In short, Mr President, I think we have to ask ourselves in relation to this bill, what value did the state receive, will the state receive for foregoing the revenue that is represented in it, that $39 million? Is that best use of our shared resources, this gift to property owners? We should absolutely be being very careful in our current context, knowing the pressures on our state budget, knowing that there are many responsibilities the state government has to meet in this current pandemic that we are still in. We should be particularly careful about how we allocate our resources. And I would absolutely put it to this chamber and to the community that $39 million as a gift to people like us is the wrong way for us to be investing $39 million precious dollars from our state resources when we know that there are people out there in much more dire need for services and support that could be delivered with that money.
Question is that the